Hello and welcome to this edition of Inside Tacoma. I'm your host, Randall Lewis. Our guest for our conversation today, Deputy Mayor Anders Ibsen. Welcome back.
Good morning.
Great to have you here, and I want to see, we're about midway through the year of being Deputy Mayor.
Yes.
Okay, what's that like?
It's no different. It's just a title. You just have to run a meeting every so often, cut a few more ribbons. For all those watching, Deputy Mayor is not a big deal. It's just a ceremonial title. We all take turns once a year. But you know, it's fun being in that role, supporting the mayor and seeing what I can do to help.
Now, you're Deputy Mayor when she's out of town, for example, but you can't really do things that she would not want you to do. Right?
Occasionally you might have to sign something, but other than that, no.
That's basically all it is.
It's nothing too arduous, no.
Okay. So like Lieutenant Governor takes over for the governor when he leaves the state?
No, I'm not the Lieutenant Mayor, Andy.
Not the Lieutenant Mayor. Okay, all right. Just Deputy Mayor. All right. And but you also had to take some time out for some personal activities of your own. So congratulations on your recent marriage.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, we were in India for 2 weeks. It was pretty hot. Glad to be back.
I imagine it was.
But beautiful country, though.
That's what everybody says about when they go to India. It's hot.
Yeah, consistently 105 some degrees, 100% humidity. Perfect food, though.
Oh, perfect food. Okay,
yeah.
Well, that's great. And again, congratulations.
Yes.
So when you're back, you took some time off to in the midst of a very busy year for the city council.
Of course, yeah.
With a new mayor and some new council members, and a lot going on in our community. And I want to talk about a couple of those. One is the ICE facility, the Northwest Detention Center, that's in Tacoma. It's been a lot of press attention. Both newspaper and TV stations seem to be in Tacoma a lot.
Sure.
A lot of community activism. I understand there's been like protests every night at 9 p.m., which is an interesting time to pick. But that's been going on. So this is kind of new. Tacoma has not been a center of lots of public and widespread news coverage protests over the past. We've had some things with methanol plants and LNG plants, but this is different. This involves a broader perspective of the community. It's been more sustained, and it's certainly spilled over into council activities at times.
Sure. Well, it's very commendable, and actually I'd say it's not that new, because it was almost 2 years ago that the city council designated ourselves as a welcoming city for immigrants. We created an immigrant and refugee task force of volunteer citizens throughout the city who have emigrated from various countries to advise us on how we can make Tacoma more friendly to immigrants. And we even started the process for funding an immigrant legal defense fund for people with civil legal matters like immigration who might need the assistance of legal representation. So in that sense, helping immigrants and taking a vocal stand on immigration-related issues is not new. It's something that the council has taken seriously for years. But I think it's very commendable how people are taking local leadership to federal issues that are impacting hundreds of thousands, if not millions of people throughout the country. And I say they're doing a great job.
Okay. And you think most of the folks that are protesting or who come before a citizens forum or something like that at the city council understand that this is actually federal activity and that the city has done the things that you've mentioned, but we can't shut the facility down. We can't tell it to go away because we don't like the policies of the federal administration.
Sure, right. I mean, I can talk all day about my views on federal policies, but ultimately, yes, you're correct. The detention center is privately owned, and the city never signed a contract with them. They are contracting with ICE themselves. So the detention center has its own separate arrangement with the federal government, and we're just providing law enforcement, infrastructure, basic city services like we would anywhere else.
Right. And you have put some restrictions. I mean, there were some interim regulations in the whole Tide Flats area that prevents them from expanding any further, right? So that I don't think there was any imminent plan to expand it, but if there were to be one, they can't do that.
Well, there's a broader conversation about land use we're having with the sub-area plan in the Tide Flats, and that's something we can talk about in larger detail if you'd like later on in the conversation. But ultimately, this isn't really about land use that people care about. It's about ensuring that the people in the facility know that they're supported. I think that's why there's so much regularity in people demonstrating peacefully down there is just letting people know that they're cared for. And I think also it's part of a larger national discussion that people want humane, rational immigration policy, not punitive, erratic policy.
Right. And the issue of the legal representation is the fact that people who are detained for immigration purposes are not guaranteed representation by the U.S. Constitution.
Right, and that's leaving aside the questions of separating children from their parents, or putting kids in cages for God's sake, or having toddlers stand trial in immigration court. I mean, there's outright madness in our immigration system, and people in our local communities have to make a stand. That's what our citizens are doing, and I'm really proud of them.
All right. Well, the other thing that I expect you hear a lot from constituents these days is it's the area in which you work when you're not being a city council member, and that is real estate. Tacoma is, seems like every week on some list regarding the highest increases in rent, the most popular place to live. I mean, there's a lot of growth and attention on real estate and low prices in Tacoma that we've known and kind of enjoyed for many years.
Low prices for people from King County. They're not low for people who've been living here for some time.
Right. So Tacoma's changing as a result of the kind of spillover from the growth market that's really intense in King County. And it's causing some issues to come before the city council. Tenant rights, for example.
Yes, that's right. And I see this every single day. I work as both a realtor and an appraiser, and I see the less than half of a month of inventory in up-and-coming markets like Hilltop, like Eastside Tacoma, all the time, impacting prices. And to your question about landlord-tenant regulations, tenant protections, undoubtedly we've had these conversations about what happened with the Tiki apartments and people evicted because there was a sale and the new landlord wanted to renovate it and rent it out to tenants who are able to pay more. And that's what started this conversation with the city council about what more can we do now that these issues have really come home to roost. And so I'm not on the committee that's making the recommendations before the city council, but I'm anticipating we'll see recommendations for everything from solidifying the notice requirements when your landlord says you have to go because they're remodeling your apartment, for example. Notice requirements if you're going to have a rent increase of more than 10%, for example. The establishment of some kind of relocation fund for lower income tenants if you're a senior citizen, if you're disabled, to help you get on your feet at another place if you are getting displaced in some way, shape, or form, and anything along those lines. So we're going to hear from a variety of people from different walks of life and different perspectives, but I think it's a great conversation to have, and it's very timely, that's for sure.
Well, one issue that I think is on the agenda as well that has been discussed at the state level where I work for the city is this issue of source of income, which I frankly did not even know existed as an issue until a few years ago. And that is that landlords can deny renting to someone based on where their money comes from, not whether they have enough, but just where it comes from, which on its face seems kind of crazy. And what they basically were saying was, no, because you get Section 8 housing from the federal government through HUD, we're not going to rent to you for that. We only want you rent to you if your income from your job it brings in that kind of money. And so the city is looking at source of income legislation as well.
Adding that as a protected class. So for clarification, what that would mean is that just like your landlord can't refuse to rent to you if you're black, or if you have children, for example, or if you're married or not married, this would add that as a protected class so that your landlord can't discriminate based on where you get your source of income for paying rent. So that is a recommendation that I think we're going to be looking at as part of our slew of different tenant protection regulations. I think that's long been a recommendation from city staff. And we'll definitely hear from a lot of people, but I expect that's something that'll get a lot of support.
And it isn't common for cities to regulate landlord-tenant. Now, Tacoma, this isn't entirely new to Tacoma. We do have staff who handles landlord-tenant disputes.
A staff person. One very champion staff who I have the utmost respect for.
Yes.
Thank you, Chiquata.
Overworked. But the point was, we have sort of stuck our toe into landlord-tenant regulations in the past, but what we're looking at now is something much broader and something that only a handful of cities in Washington do.
Right, but Washington is very unique because, as you mentioned, Randy, we are one of the most highly accelerating rental markets in the world. Not just in the country, but in the world. British Columbia all the way down to Portland and California, the western coast of North America has some of the highest growing and some of the highest per capita rents on earth. So if that doesn't warrant special localized attention, I'm not sure what does.
All right, so these are issues that are coming before us, and yet we also see other ways that this whole growth issue, the attention towards Tacoma from outside folks, which is nice to see, plays out in other ways too, and it's fun to watch it on Facebook and other social media.
Sure.
The discussion seems
Don't read the comments, Randy.
I try not to, but it's hard sometimes. Because it so quickly always devolves to parking, and the issue of being able to park at your front door, which seems to be something that people, there is at least a group of folks in Tacoma who believe that's kind of a right, that I should be able to park in front of my front door. And that is something that's both changing culturally, as well as it's just changing in reality, because the parking turns out to be a very expensive thing to use land for.
Well, let me say that I'm really sensitive to people who are approaching that from a perspective of access. And in my district, we actually had this conversation about 2.5 years ago with the Ruston Senior Center, where there was conversation about getting rid of a surplus parking lot and building some residential infill, which generally I support residential infill. We're a city. But at the same time, these are people in their 70s and 80s who might get dropped off by their son or daughter, right? So there's certainly a room for balance. Generally speaking, though, I agree that we're a city, and we have to be forward-thinking in terms of how people are going to get from point A to point B. Ultimately, I think how we resolve that is less thinking of it as a zero-sum game where growth comes at the expense of your car. I don't think that's a winning message. Right. What I do think is a winning message, and what I think a lot of people do get behind, is safety and choice. A great example of that in District 1 was the North 21st Street conversation around everywhere from Westgate to Proctor, where we've put in these beautiful new power lines, thanks to Tacoma Power.
But we're rid of the rusty ones, yes.
Yes, we got rid of the rusty ones, and we've even preserved the power station on the historic register too. You're welcome. But we're collecting grant money, and we're in the process of applying for grant money to actually redo the street to make it safer. And overwhelmingly, when we sent out surveys into the community in that part of the North End, people agreed overwhelmingly with one of several proposed designs for that new street, and that was one lane each way, which would open it up for one, looking significantly more visually appealing than how it used to be, but also making it safer, because unfortunately we've seen collisions. We have literally seen kids get hit by cars.
Right.
And thank God they both survived and they both recovered, and I've met both of them. I mean, they're wonderful people. And what that comes to when it comes to safety is, in the case of North 21st Street, in the case of streets in general, if you drive down I Street or North 30th Street, for example, and it's rush hour, it's 7:30, you're trying to get to work, typically there's a long line. And the reason that traffic tends to slow down in part is because of the width of the street.
Right.
When you have 2-lane streets, or if you're in the suburbs, if you're driving down Canyon Road or Meridian, those multi-lane streets generally encourage you to drive faster. Whereas if the streets are narrower, you tend to drive a little bit slower. And that makes a difference when it comes to saving lives, because if you get hit at 15 or 20 miles per hour, you're going to get pretty banged up, but chances are you've got a pretty good chance of survival. You get hit at 40 miles per hour or more, you're kind of out of luck. And our transportation system down the road is really orienting more towards safety, towards choice, towards allowing people who are thinking of getting to their destination by other means, like walking, biking, taking the bus, light rail in certain areas, because
right.
Link Light Rail, we're breaking ground on the utilities this month. Ensuring that people have choices, not at the expense of anything, but just broadening those choices that are available and keeping people, and especially kids, safer. I think that's the winning message, whether it's development or whether it's new light rail opportunities or anything.
It's funny for someone who's been around a while and used to be the City Hall reporter many years ago,
Yep.
and there was one of your predecessors, City Council member Rick Evans, who was Governor Dan Evans' cousin, an architect locally here in Tacoma. And I remember doing this story about a speech he would regularly make about how Tacoma's problem was we had too many wide streets and we need to make our streets narrow. This was in the 70s. And the response from his colleagues on the council dais was usually laughter and snickering about, well, yeah, right, we need to make streets wider and make more room for cars, not make them, because people will drive slower if the streets are narrower and they'll be safer. It was a time, there was somebody even thinking about that back then.
Yes.
And I think about him often when the council has these discussions these days about traffic and traffic calming and all these kinds of things, because the world has evolved quite a bit in a relatively short period of time.
And rediscovering things that we did right 100 years ago, like streetcars, for example. I mean,
right.
Ripping those things out, that was one of the dumbest decisions we ever did, which was just at the behest of the oil and car companies, but better later than never, I suppose.
Right, we get back to them, have to rebuild them at a great expense, but nevertheless, it is the right thing to do, as voters have shown repeatedly, voting for sound transit projects 3 times now in our region.
And bus rapid transit coming down on Pacific Avenue too.
Right.
It's going to be very exciting.
Now, you briefly mentioned some activities in the Tide Flats, and I want to make sure we have a chance to talk about an event that's coming up this month.
Yes.
In kind of a unique thing that I think the community will really embrace, and I know our friends at the Puyallup Tribe are very proud to be hosting the Canoe Journey in Tacoma.
So Canoe Journey, what you refer to is a wonderful event. It's hosted by a lot of the local tribes, both in Washington State, I believe Oregon, and also British Columbia. And it's a celebration of tradition in which the canoes would land and people would exchange goods and services. There'd be weddings, there'd be celebrations and new friendships and alliances. And that continues to this day after millennia. And the city of Tacoma, for I think the first time ever, possibly, or at least the first time in a long time, is working with the Puyallup Tribe to formally support it, as different tribes take turns hosting the Canoe Journey each year. And this year, it's the Puyallup Tribe's year to host the event, which is a really great honor. And the city of Tacoma is proud to financially sponsor this event. We're also looking at ways of also symbolically expressing our friendship with the Puyallup Tribe. So it's Pride Week right now as this is being filmed, which we're also very proud to support, no pun intended. And the week after that, in which Canoe Journey is being hosted, which is going to be the week of the 28th, the city of Tacoma will be flying the flag of the Puyallup Nation above City Hall, much the same way that we fly the Pride flag during Pride Week. And it's our way of strengthening a relationship that's been there, but we always could have done a better job in fostering that relationship in terms of how we work together on projects, how we communicate. And that's something I'm very proud to work with Mayor Woodard's on, is her leadership and her willingness to begin that dialogue and to mend the older wounds and make that relationship stronger as a result. And I see that collaboration not just with Canoe Journey, but with, as you'd mentioned, the upcoming sub-area plan conversation, in which we take a look at the Tide Flats, Port of Tacoma area, and we envision what we want that place to look like 30, 40, 50 years down the road. The Puyallup Tribe is a strong partner in that process, and I see them being even stronger with us on so many other issues down the road.
It is kind of a growth in the evolution of what began with the land claim settlement, which was back in the 90s, which grew out of the unfortunate periods of the fish wars as they become popularly known. But this seems to be taking that whole settlement and the treatment of the tribe as a fellow government, someone important in our culture and our history and our just day-to-day living as well, plus a major employer in our community, and just taking that to another level, which is both culturally and entertaining, because the Canoe Journey will certainly have an entertainment value as well.
Yeah.
And we're talking about lots of canoes, and they're going to be coming in on the far side, not the Foss Waterway side, but the far side of the Commencement Bay over by the Hylibus and the tribe's marina over there, as I understand it. Mm-hmm. So there'll be some impacts along Marine View Drive.
Yeah, but it's going to be wonderful, and we're really excited about it.
All right, and then the land use plan that's certainly something. We're back to that same area where we started with the discussion of the detention center.
Yes.
But there's other stuff that's been kind of in the community's mind over the years. We've got the future of the port. Mm-hmm. Obviously, let's talk about fossil fuels, because
that's the elephant in the room.
It's the elephant in the room. There's a lot of, even set aside an LNG plant that isn't operating yet, there is fossil fuel activity in the Port of Tacoma right now. It's not on the port's land, it's on privately owned property. We don't anticipate the land use plan, the sub-area plan, saying that stuff's going to shut down and go away.
No, by law it can't. What this is about is thinking far ahead and being wise and imagining in 30, 40, 50 years, what do we want the port to look like? What kind of jobs, what kind of planning, what kind of infrastructure do we want to emphasize? So leaving aside the enormous bigger elephant in the room, which is climate change and how that's going to impact our region. For example, the Port of Tacoma, if we don't build seawalls and we don't mitigate rising sea level, it'll be submerged by 2100, completely submerged underwater, and partially submerged by 2060, I think. In Alaska, they had to move the Iditarod further north because there wasn't enough snow. I mean, this is something that's truly impacting our region's economy. It's impacting the livelihoods of industries like fishermen, who are seeing significantly lower catches because of ocean acidification. And that's leaving aside our air quality, which we've come really close to being near the agreed upon threshold due to all the forest fires in British Columbia. And it's really serious stuff, Randy. Right. And this isn't going to cure this overnight. And you're right in that it can't, by law, affect businesses that are already there. They have a right to be there because they're pre-existing uses. But this is taking a look at what kind of economy, what kind of neighborhood, what kind of city we want to be in 30 to 50 years. And in just imagining, what kind of industries do we want to have? Are we going to have energy sources from the 19th century, from the 18th century even, like coal and oil? Or do we want to think about renewables, or do we want to think about carbon neutral industries that actually grow jobs? Do we want to think about what was prominent in the past versus what are the industries that actually make us competitive and employ significantly more people? And how do we back those industries up with the right kinds of infrastructure, and how do we do everything sustainably? So those are the thoughts going into it. And as I mentioned, the Puyallup Tribe has been a wonderful partner in that process. We're also working with the Port of Tacoma as another co-lead. And we're going to be deciding on an interlocal agreement very soon.
Right. And the other thing about clean energy jobs that I think was prominent in the previous administration talked about the other beauty of those jobs is they can't be exported.
Right.
Because of the very nature that they have to be here where the energy is being used. So I think that's also a good piece of that. So that plan is something that's still happening.
Yes.
It hasn't begun yet, but it's still going to happen. And so we expect to see that sometime in the remaining time of your term as deputy mayor?
Oh, I think we're going to start the interlocal agreement this summer. That's my understanding.
Okay. All right. Well, we are out of time. So it's been great to have you here and catch up on all the things you've been up to and going on in the city, and we'll look forward to having you back again.
Thank you, Randy.
All right. Our guest has been Deputy Mayor Anders Ibsen. We look forward to seeing you next time here on Inside Tacoma.